This is a video about art, video games as an art form, and how art is perceived, not about if it's objectively scary or not, or anything shallow like that. Also, at the same time, I am not trying to come across as pretentious, going like, actually, you've all been interpreting this piece of media incorrectly. No, I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to put my opinion forward to try and start some new discussion. If you have any kind of interest whatsoever in internet mysteries or indie games, there's a pretty high chance you've heard of Yume Nikki. In fact, I'd be more surprised if you haven't heard of it at this point. It's far from the mysterious game it was years ago, in my opinion. Yume Nikki is an RPG Maker game created by Kikiyama in which you explore a young girl's dreams, collecting various objects to gather effect. The game has no dialogue or story, and had various developmental versions distributed over the course of 3 years as freeware. The game's unexplained nature and lack of, well, anything is one of the reasons it skyrocketed in popularity. It was mysterious. The lack of dialogue made it so anyone could really pick it up regardless of language barrier, and localization was really easy. And the way it explained nothing and left what you had to do, essentially shrouded in mystery, meant that if you wanted to do anything, you kind of had to talk to somebody else about it. This made the game a pretty easy cult classic. To quickly paraphrase from Wikipedia, yeah, Wikipedia, I know. The gameplay and atmosphere were well received by critics who identified the game's exploration as a major appeal, and the world was enjoyable to explore. Though some major criticisms were the lack of any guides or maps, and how easy the player got stuck. The game's nature, in both what it succeeded with and failed with, combined to make a kind of perfect storm. You had to talk about it, or read someone else talking about it. Over the years, Yume Nikki has gone on to inspire many other game developers and is even credited for kickstarting the RPG Maker horror genre. If you haven't already, watch Thaf9's video for more on this. I'd say it's basically required reading for this subject. I'm serious, watch it and then come back here. That's your homework now. That's your required reading. Shoutouts to Thaf9, he signed my copy of Flight Simulator for Windows 98. So, essentially, Yume Nikki was one of the first games to spark the horror subgenre of this engine due to how it created the perfect atmosphere for discussion, going on to inspire many other game developers. But, as the title suggests, I'm here to put forward a question. Is Yume Nikki really a horror game? Well, it's got a lot of horror themes throughout, right? I feel like to answer this question, we need to remove Yume Nikki itself from our ideas of it. Essentially, take the game for what it is on an objective level. Forget about all the theories and discussions we've read and basically reject about 20 years worth of discussion. I feel like this is way easier said than done. As previously mentioned, the game itself has no narrative and is entirely shrouded in mystery. Every aspect of lore or story is in the environment and what you see, which is even harder to piece together when you consider how this game is so surreal looking. Using the game itself and no fan interpretations or theories or anything, what in this game is horror? Well, one thing that makes Yume Nikki scary to the audience is the fact that nothing is explained. One common trigger for fear is uncertainty. Not knowing what's happening or not being able to predict what might happen can trigger worry in many cases, and this technique is used frequently within the horror genre to stir unease in the viewer. In general, Yume Nikki is a very unpredictable game with many areas being seemingly random and disjointed. You could be in one area that looks bright and walk through one single doorway and suddenly you're somewhere completely different. And none of this is explained. It makes sense as to why the game comes off as creepy or scary when you consider the fear of unknown being so widespread. This is a game where everything is unknown. Again, nothing is explained. We don't know why these surreal looking, constantly changing visuals are there. Combine this with the game's rather unique soundtrack consisting of just ambient noise or short melodies, and there's no real debate as to why this game is considered scary to many players. Another point that I feel supports this argument for Yume Nikki being a horror game is that there are indeed very objective horror events within the game. I used the term jump scare in my script here, but I think I'm stretching the definition quite a bit because I just don't really know how you would describe these moments. If there is a better word I should have used here, I sincerely apologize, but I'm running on 2 Red Bulls. The most commonly discussed horror event is Uboas, which I think everyone knows about.
First try, by the way.
The bit in Boniko's house where if you turn the lights on and off, she turns into a monster and the game starts screaming at you. The door is locked, the furniture grows eyes, the entire atmosphere changes, and you can't escape. Your only choice is to wake up from the nightmare. Uboa's event is noted as being one of the most iconic scenes within the game, so I don't really feel I have much more to add to this. Yeah, this is a pretty objective jump scare. Another part of the game I always felt was scary was the guillotine world, to give an example. I actually stumbled upon this in my first ever playthrough when I was about 10 years old. You step through one door and the juxtaposition is unsettling. The room is full of enemies chasing you, the entire color scheme is different, and the audio just sounds like it's yelling at you. It's just a hostile place that you kind of just wander into. Needless to say, the sudden change creeped me out big time as a kid, but hey, that's probably why I remember it so well. Another contributing factor to Yume Nikki's characterization as a horror game is the themes of death present. There's a lot of examples of people dying or being killed scattered throughout the game, so I'm just gonna briefly list some examples. In the dense woods, a man can be found in a pool of blood surrounded by traffic cones. Interacting with him gives a stoplight effect, so it's pretty explicit that this is meant to be a car accident scene. The man does nothing but lay there, but twitches when specific effects are used near him. In the stairway to the Sky Garden, a man can sometimes be seen falling from the sky. There are severed heads with blood in the white desert that disappear when the player leaves, and one of the effects, the triangle kerchief or spirit headband, is a direct cultural reference to Ghosts and the Dead in Japan, and of course, there's the ending scene that I won't be mentioning because I would like this video to be mostly spoiler-free. I don't care if the game is 20 years old, someone out there will thank. So all of these themes kind of mix together to create what many consider to be a horror experience. The lack of explanation creates the fear of the unknown, the juxtaposition of different colors and themes creates an unpredictability, there's some events in the game that are pretty close to jump scare territory, and there's undeniable themes of death and dying throughout. Most people, this qualifies a game as horror pretty objectively, right? Right? Well, you would be right. The game does come off this way to its audience. But what does the artist behind it think of it? Meet the developer of Yume Nikki themselves, or rather, what we know about the creator of Yume Nikki themselves. Kikiyama, an individual who we know nothing about except what they think of their work, and thanks to Toby Fox, creator of Undertale and Deltarune, as well as a bunch of bangers from Homestuck and Hiveswap, a Denny's order. Yeah, when I say we know nothing about this guy, I really do mean it. For nearly 20 years, all we had was his bare bones website and nothing else. After Yume Nikki gained traction online, Kikiyama released a handwritten FAQ to his website about the game. When translated into English, it reads as follows. What kind of a game is it? DS? PS2? This is a PC game created with RPG Maker and released for free on the internet. What's the genre? It isn't horror, neither Guru. A warm-hearted game. I want to try playing it, but how do I do it? Do I need to pay? What you need to do is download Yume Nikki and RPG Maker 2003's RTP data to play it, both for free. I can't leave the room. Use the bed to go to sleep. Where should I go? You can go anywhere. What should I do? You can do anything. If I had to say something, then I'd recommend to collect the effects. Effects? Collecting them is more enjoyable than just walking. I can't seem to find them. Keep trying. This translation was from a forum thread that now 404s, so I grabbed it from the fandom wiki. Unfortunately, the translator goes uncredited on this article. CertifiedFandom.com moment. The line I'm specifically focusing on here is, "It isn't horror, neither Guru." This is about as explicit as you can get for how the creator views it. It's not a horror game, and death or gore isn't major either. As for calling it warm-hearted, I will be entirely real with you, I have no clue what this means. The phrase itself just means that it's welcoming or affectionate, but I have no idea if this is meant to be a translation of a specific Japanese idiom or not. If you're better at Japanese than I am, let me know about this one. As I said, this was 404, so I can't really check translators' notes. Kikiyama has also mentioned that the game has no particular story or purpose and is simply an exploring game. This quote is taken from the section of their website where they hosted the game itself, which now unfortunately seems to have expired. Still on the Wayback Machine though. This lines up with the FAQ pretty well. The dark atmosphere is noted, but Kikiyama refuses to call it anything other than an exploration game. Needless to say, this gives a pretty sharp difference between how the creator views the game versus how the fanbase views it. So let's consider Kikiyama's opinions and reassess the game, shall we? One thing that I think is important to note is just how big of a game Yume Nikki actually is. I mean, look at this flowchart, and this doesn't even show the full scale of the maps themselves. The game also has 24 effects to collect and numerous events. It's not small by any means. Yes, it has a lot of horror aspects, hence the dark atmosphere comment, but I feel that for every objective piece of horror there is within this thing, there's about double in just nonsense. In my opinion, I feel like an exploring game with a weird atmosphere is probably the best way to describe it. It has its aspects, but when you compare those aspects to everything else present, they kind of get buried in nonsense. Another thing I'd like to bring up is how the word surreal is passed around whenever the game is discussed. I've used it a couple times throughout this script. This is where we get more into speculative territory as I start treating the game a bit less as a game and more as a piece of art. I've had to study surrealism quite a bit, so I'd like to put my own opinions forward on how Yume Nikki itself can be considered a surrealist work in its composition, and how these same compositional quirks align with the environmental decisions that many consider to be creepy. Remember when I said earlier about how the visuals are constantly quite unpredictable? Well, some key motifs of the surrealist movement involved non sequitur or quick juxtapositions. If the game was intended to be more surreal than anything else, perhaps this aspect that many consider to be creepy had different intentions that didn't translate as the artist intended. This may be straying slightly from the topic at hand, please forgive me. I've had this script open in a new tab for at least a year and a half at this point, so I would be lying to you if I said I wasn't kind of rushing to get this video to stop haunting me. But I feel that Yume Nikki's core, an exploration of someone's subconscious, is about as Bretonist as you can get. Breton was one of the founders of the Surrealist movement and the author of the Surrealist Manifesto, a very influential journal outlining and defining surrealism as it expanded as a movement. In this book, Breton wrote that the movement sought to release the powers of the unconscious and to resolve the previously contradictory conditions of dream and reality into an absolute reality, or a super reality. To say that Yume Nikki follows and portrays this philosophy perfectly would kind of be an understatement. I actually wrote a very long essay in college about Kikiyama's work aligning perfectly with Bretonist ideals, but that's forever lost on my art teacher's hard drive at this point, never to see the light of day again. Miss Johnson, if you're watching this video right now, can you please free my essays from the depths of your hard drive, because you never gave me my A-level sketchbook back with all the printouts. Another more recent point that I feel backs my points up is again from Toby Fox's interview. In this interview, Kikiyama said that they'd played Osamu Sato's games, name-dropping Dream Emulator LSD. I've never really interacted with Sato's work myself, nor have I played Dream Emulator, but from what I've seen, there's a lot of surrealist motifs present here. Sato's website also showcases a lot of abstract pieces, and if Kikiyama drew inspiration from here, I can definitely see it. Again, all of this is speculation. Kikiyama only said yes or no in the interview, and we don't know if they discovered Sato's work before or after making the game. As with all artists whose work we discuss, analyze, and dissect, we have no way to know what they're thinking unless they tell us. And from the few comments we have, as well as inferences we can take from 20 years of anonymity, Kikiyama doesn't want to tell us anything. This makes their work possibly as subjective as we can get, and maybe it's better this way. When you consider how video games are an art form, I think it's not out of the question to analyze them as such. Art, as we know, is subjective. My opinion on Yume Nikki aligns with Kikiyama's own views. I don't think that its horror elements make it a horror game. It's unsettling and some parts are very explicitly horror, but I feel like the horror aspects present are kind of dramatized by the fanbase, if that makes sense. To me, the game is like an interactive exhibition. It makes no sense and it doesn't have to make sense, but at the same time, I can see why this horror reputation was gained. When nothing is explained in art, the audience's first thought is to try and explain it. And with how creepiness is what sticks out the most with people, it's no real mystery as to why theories tend to be so dark. I mean, As previously mentioned, the majority of the game is unexplained nonsense. If there's a few aspects that you can interpret as something, that something being scary, of course, those are the aspects that people are going to discuss the most. This is what they feel they can understand. Yume Nikki, horror or not, is one unique video game that spawned a whole genre of horror. If this was an accident, and it really was just meant to be some Bretonist adventure game, then I'd argue that just makes it all the more interesting. In an art gallery, the artist and audience are equally important. I also don't think that horror and the abstract are mutually exclusive. In fact, far from it. As previously mentioned, the topics are subjective. What's intended to be one thing by the author could be picked up by the audience as something else. To name one example, I think that everyone is familiar with Scott Cawthon's Chipper and Sons Lumber Co., which was intended to be family friendly by the artist and interpreted as uncanny and creepy by critics. It all leads back to the same concept. If you want a recommendation for an RPG Maker horror game that balances absurdity, surrealism, creepy-ass visuals, and a rather unnerving story, play Off by Mortis Ghost. Don't look up anything about it, just pick it up and play it. I mean, it's completely free to download. I promise that if what I've been discussing interests you at all, this is the game for you, but anyway, I'll cut this off now before I can get any deeper into my art student rambles. Is Yume Nikki really a horror game? Well, it's a lot more complex to answer than yes or no. I personally don't think it is, but maybe we'll get the answer in the form of another Denny's order in another 20 years by a different indie game developer. This has been Banui. So long and good night.